If you find yourself beaten up or beaten down by all that is happening or not happening in the middle of our world today, today is your day. Today is a day for and about exhausted people, frightened people, people of little faith. I need to make clear at the get-go that little faith is not the same thing as no faith. Little faith is like 5 tiny loaves of bread and 2 fish in the face of thousands of hungry people. In other words, little faith is more than enough for Jesus to work with. You are enough. In these stories, you will hear about how God interacts with people like us, who are worried that we are not enough and that our faith is very small. Our first reading today begins with the mighty prophet Elijah hiding in a cave. He had just called on God to bring down fire from heaven and destroy all the prophets of Baal right before his eyes, and God did. So why is he hiding in a cave? He just witnessed a miracle. Because, although he has seen God's mighty power at work, he fears retribution from King Ahab and Queen Jezebel for the death of their prophets. Likewise, in today's gospel lesson, there's another image of God's chosen ones cowering in fear after having just witnessed a miracle. The disciples had just that day, literally, helped Jesus feed 5,000 men plus women and children. Now they are terrified because they are in the midst of a great storm, and Jesus is not with them. No doubt in need of relief from the psychological and maybe physical or physiological results of healing and feeding people all day long, as well as the news of his cousin John the Baptist's murder, Jesus has stayed behind to pray. Evidently, it is possible to believe simultaneously, as Elijah and the disciples certainly did, that God can do mighty things in the world and for the world, while also retreating into the lizard brain of fear. People respond differently to fear, some with fight, some with flight, some with temporary paralysis. Elijah and the disciples, especially poor dear Peter, are each succumbing to fear in their own ways, and each of these ways work against their trust in God's providing grace. Elijah's primary concern seems to be that he is alone. He complains at least twice in today's reading that there is no one left except him to face the pushback that comes from worshiping God. What he asks for, to assuage his fear, is companionship. And God provides. God assures Elijah that he's not the only one, that 7,000 other people have not bowed to Baal and also survive. God has heard Elijah's panic and does not scold him for his lack of trust, for his little faith. Instead, God provides what Elijah needs. God reveals God's own presence in powerful storm and fire, and also in the silence that follows the storm. Later, in the verses that follow today's reading from 1 Kings, Elijah is introduced to Elisha, who becomes his student and his friend for the rest of his life. So if today you find yourself in a cave of loneliness, call out to God, for God is eager and willing to hear you and to help. The disciples also cry out to God to save them. But in their case, when Jesus walks to them across the water, they don't sigh with relief and recognition, feeling that their redemption has come near. Instead, they wonder if they're seeing a ghost and not their teacher and friend. Sometimes when we are in situations that frighten us, we imagine that God is not present. Because if God were around, surely we wouldn't be in this mess. But there is no biblical promise that trusting God and following God's call will keep us safe. Ask John Lewis. God's mission moves us from places of security and calm into the outrageous business of living out justice and mercy in the world, even if out in the world means something different now in the pandemic. Now we may make connections over Zoom, or several feet apart in backyards, or on porches or patios or Facebook, but always wearing masks. Any form that it takes, following Jesus, radically embracing the poor, the outcast, the widows and the orphans, while rejecting false religions like militarism, nationalism, and white supremacy, means we will encounter storms. And that may scare us so much that we might want to hide in a cave. Or we may embark bravely on a risky adventure, only to realize midway through that we are shouting along with Peter, "Lord, save me!" Peter, like King Lear, seems to have absolutely lost his mind in this storm. As the other disciples wonder whether or not Jesus is really approaching them over the water, Peter shouts out, "If that's really you, command me to come out there to you over the water." I cannot imagine why he asks this, and why he doesn't ask that Jesus calm the waves. But clearly he wants, in some way, to trust Jesus, and so he asks for this impossible thing. And briefly, he manages. I admire his passion and vulnerability, and I'm grateful that when Peter's audacity fails and he starts to drown, Jesus pulls him back from his misstep rather than letting him sink with his imperfect faith. This is the good news, my friends. Having little faith does not cause Jesus to abandon us to the waves. Jesus does not reach out his arms to punish, but to save Peter and the rest of us. So, church, we face the battering waves of strong headwinds, uncertain about what is going on and what this pandemic means and when it will end, exhausted by trying to navigate it and all kinds of other challenges in the middle of it. Together, let us cry out to Jesus, "Save us." However fragile we feel, however little our faith, let's bring it all to a God who heals and feeds and rescues and listens to uncertainty and struggle. Let us bring to God our concerns about next steps, about finances, about change, about everything as the cultural waters around us churn and shift. And as we cry out, let us collectively hang on to this beautiful truth that although Jesus withdrew for a time, as soon as the disciples cried out in fear, immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And again, when Peter cried out as he began to sink below the waves, Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him. So no matter how small our faith, no matter how fearful we might feel, no matter what we do or refrain from doing, Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, comes across the threatening seas toward us, arms outstretched, saying, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Thanks be to God.